He just cut a hole in the wall of his house, and the whole town laughed at him. But when the deadliest blizzard in history struck, that was where everyone ran. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The cold always reached Elijah Brooks before the dawn did. It slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls like a living thing, searching, persistent, as if it knew exactly where his bones lay beneath the thin blankets. On mornings like this, he woke not because he was rested, but because the air inside the room had grown sharp enough to cut his lungs when he drew breath. His eyes opened to darkness, mottled by faint silver patterns on the ceiling, where frost had crept across the boards in the night, blooming like dead flowers that no warmth had come to chase away. He lay still for a moment, listening to the hollow quiet that followed a long winter night, broken only by the distant creak of timber as the cabin contracted in the cold. Somewhere in the hearth, a coal glowed red, stubbornly clinging to life, but it offered little more than the promise of heat rather than the thing itself. When he finally swung his legs over the edge of the bed, the boards under his bare feet felt like slabs of ice. He had learned long ago to keep his boots near the fire, but even so, the leather was stiff and brittle in the mornings, and his fingers ached as he forced them open and slid his feet inside. The breath left his mouth in white clouds, drifting upward and vanishing into the dimness. The bucket of water he had carried in from the creek the evening before bore a skin of cloudy ice across its surface, and he broke it with the handle of his knife, the crack loud in the stillness. He drank anyway, ignoring the pain that shot through his teeth, because thirst was a harder thing to endure than cold. This was his winter routine, played out day after day in a cabin that looked solid enough from the outside, but had never truly learned how to keep the world at bay. He had built it himself after he came north, with the little money he had and the greater share of determination, hauling logs from the tree line and fitting them together with more care than skill. The roof was pitched steeply enough to shed snow, the door hung straight, the fireplace drew properly when the wind allowed it, but none of that mattered when January came and the land around him froze into a thing hostile to breath and blood alike. He stuffed moss into the seams, layered old cloth where the boards warped, even hammered flattened tin over the worst gaps, yet every night the cold found its way in, settling into the walls and floors as though it belonged there. Outside the cabin, the world lay under a pale blue glaze, the pre-dawn light reflecting off fields that had long since stopped pretending to be anything but empty. His patch of land lay at the far edge of the settlement, beyond the last cluster of houses where the forest thinned and the ground rose toward a low, stony hill. He had chosen it because it was cheap, because no one else had wanted to live so far out, and because after years of being told where he could and could not go, he valued the quiet distance. But the quiet came with a price. When winter bore down on Hullridge, it did not discriminate between the heart of town and its margins, yet those who lived closer together could share wood, share walls, share warmth. Elijah had only his own hands and the stubbornness that had carried him this far. He dressed quickly, pulling on every layer he owned, patched wool and worn cotton that still smelled faintly of wood smoke, no matter how often he washed it. His breath fogged the small window as he glanced outside. Snow lay undisturbed across the slope behind the cabin, the drifts smooth as untouched flour. It was a sight that might have been beautiful under other circumstances, but all he felt was the weight of another day spent fighting the same enemy. He stoked the fire with the last of the split logs he had stacked by the hearth, watching them catch and flare, knowing even as he did it that he was burning tomorrow's warmth for today's survival. He stepped outside to fetch more wood, the door protesting with a groan as he pulled it open. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs for a moment, and he stood on the threshold until his chest remembered how to work. The hill loomed behind the cabin, its face mottled with rock and frozen earth, its crest hidden in a faint veil of drifting snow. He had passed it 100 times without a thought, but this morning, as he trudged across the yard toward the woodpile, something about it held his attention. Perhaps it was the way the wind curled around it, perhaps the way the snow seemed thinner near its base, but his eyes kept straying there, as though the hill itself were trying to tell him something. He worked through the morning in the same quiet rhythm he always did, splitting logs, stacking them closer to the cabin, moving his hands constantly to keep the blood flowing. The sky brightened, but the warmth did not follow. By midday he had burned through more wood than he liked to admit, and when he finally paused to rest, leaning on the handle of his axe, he let his gaze wander again to the slope behind the cabin. This time he walked toward it, not quite knowing why, drawn by an unease he could not name. The snow crunched under his boots, the sound loud in the empty air, until he stood close enough to see the faint dark seam running along the base of the hill. It was a crack in the stone where the earth had split long ago, no wider than his forearm, but deep enough that he could not see the end of it. He crouched and brushed the snow away, exposing bare rock beneath, and as he did so, he felt it. A subtle difference in the air that had nothing to do with the wind. He held his hand near the opening, expecting the usual bite of winter, and instead felt something almost gentle, a breath that was not warm so much as not cold. He frowned and leaned closer, peering into the narrow darkness, then reached inside with gloved fingers. The chill was there, but muted, as though the earth itself were standing between him and the worst of the season. He withdrew his hand and stared at it for a long moment, his mind working in quiet circles. He had seen animals vanish into holes like this before, badgers and foxes that slipped beneath the frozen skin of the world and did not emerge until spring. He had never questioned where they went, only accepted that they were better at winter than he was. Now, standing at the mouth of the hill's hidden seam, he wondered if the difference lay not in their fur or their instincts, but in their refusal to remain above ground when the cold came to claim its due. The thought stayed with him as he returned to the cabin, as he chopped more wood, as he ate a thin meal by the hearth and felt the heat fade from his body as soon as he leaned back. He thought of the crack in the hill while he lay awake that night, listening to the wind rise outside, tracing the lines of frost on the ceiling with his eyes. He imagined what it might be like beyond that narrow opening, how the world might sound when wrapped in earth instead of air, how the cold might lose its edge when pressed back by tons of stone and soil. The idea was dangerous. He knew that even then, because it asked him to do the one thing he had never done before, to tear into the only shelter he had in pursuit of something he could not yet see. By morning, the notion had not faded, and he carried it with him like a hidden ember, warming and unsettling him in equal measure. He found himself studying the back wall of the cabin as he worked, the boards that stood between him and the hill beyond. He had raised those walls with his own hands, had driven every nail, sealed every seam, but now they looked less like protection and more like a barrier, an arbitrary line that said this far and no further. The crack in the hill had shown him otherwise. The land behind his cabin was not an enemy. It was a shield he had never considered using. He knew the town would laugh if he spoke of it. Hallridge was not a place that welcomed new ideas, especially not from a man who lived at its edge and spoke little. They had their ways of surviving winter, and none of them involved digging into the ground like an animal. He could already hear the tone of their voices, the certainty with which they would dismiss the notion, and he felt a familiar tightening in his chest at the thought. Yet, the cold did not care what the town thought, and neither did the hill behind his cabin. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridge and the temperature fell with it, Elijah sat alone at his rough-hewn table, the crack in the hill vivid in his mind. He did not have a plan yet, only the sense that something had shifted, that the winter he had been enduring rather than mastering had finally offered him a way out. The cabin creaked and settled around him. The fire dwindled, and he drew his coat tighter, staring at the back wall as though he could see through it. Somewhere beyond those boards the earth lay waiting, steady and indifferent, holding a warmth that had nothing to do with flames or fuel. And for the first time since he had come north, he felt the faint outline of an answer forming in the cold. The idea did not announce itself with clarity or triumph. It lingered in Elijah Brooks like a bruise you only notice when you move the wrong way, dull at first, then insistent, pressing against every thought that was not directly tied to keeping himself alive. He woke before dawn with the sensation of earth on his skin, the memory of that faint, almost courteous warmth he had felt inside the crack in the hill, and it followed him through the gray morning like a second shadow. Even as he went about the rituals of another winter day, coaxing a fire from embers, breaking ice in the bucket, pulling on stiff clothes, part of his mind was already working on a problem that had never existed before. He had never considered the land itself as anything but a surface to cross or a source of wood and stone. Now he found himself thinking in terms of depth instead of distance, of layers instead of miles. When the sun rose pale and thin behind clouds that promised nothing but more cold, he pulled on his coat and walked toward town with a purpose he had not felt in years. Hallridge did not offer much in the way of learning, but it had a mission house that doubled as a schoolroom for the children and, more importantly to Elijah, a cupboard of books that no one seemed to care about anymore. He had learned to read well enough from his mother when he was young, long before the roads had taken him north, and he had kept the skill alive because words were cheaper than anything else in the world. The mission house was nearly empty when he arrived, the children gone for the day because the teacher had fallen ill. He nodded to the caretaker and made his way to the back room where the books were kept, their spines cracked and their pages yellowed from years of neglect. He did not know what he was looking for at first, only that it had something to do with the way the earth behaved when the cold tried to take it over. He pulled volumes at random, treatises on farming that spoke of frost lines and soil conditions, old pamphlets about cellar construction, a forgotten journal from a mining survey that described the temperature changes with depth. The language was dense, the ideas scattered, but as he read he began to piece together a picture that felt almost like a conversation with the hill itself. The deeper the ground, the more constant its nature became. The cold bit only so far, and below that invisible boundary the earth held to its own slow rhythm, warming and cooling over seasons rather than hours. He traced diagrams of root cellars, noted the mention of underground rooms and places where winter was harsher than Hallridge could imagine, and compared them to the mining sketches that showed timber supports, bracing tunnels far deeper than he would ever need to go. It was not one revelation, but 100 small ones, each adding weight to the notion that had taken root in him the day before. By the time he left the mission house, his pockets were heavy with folded notes he had copied in a careful hand, and his head ached with the effort of sorting them into something usable. He walked back to the cabin slowly, stopping more than once to stare at the hill as though it were a book he had only just learned how to read. The back wall of the cabin no longer seemed immovable. It was a problem to be solved, a boundary to be redrawn. He spent the afternoon measuring, pacing the space between the hearth and the rear of the cabin, tapping at boards to find the weakest points. He marked the spots where the logs had warped over time, where the nails no longer sat as tight as they once had. This was the wall he had built in a hurry when he first arrived, tired and eager for shelter, and it showed every shortcut he had taken. Beyond it lay the slope, rising at a shallow angle that would let him move forward and down without the need for a vertical shaft. It was not perfect, but it was enough. The problem of support occupied him next. He laid out his tools on the table, counting them, testing their edges, weighing their balance in his hands. The axe would not serve for this kind of work, but the old pick he had salvaged from a shed at the edge of town might. He imagined the earth pressing inward as he removed it, imagined the weight of the hill bearing down on whatever space he created, and the thought made his chest tighten. He had no intention of becoming a cautionary tale whispered over winter fires, so he forced himself to slow down and think in terms of systems rather than bravery. Every foot he dug would have to be reinforced before he went farther. He would need straight timber for props and crossbeams, cut and fitted to hold the ceiling in place while he worked. That night he walked the forest edge with a lantern, searching for trees that grew straight and tall enough to be of use. He marked them with notches, counting how many he would need for the first few yards of tunnel, and when he returned to the cabin his boots were heavy with snow, and his mind heavier still with the realization that he was already committed to a path he had not yet fully acknowledged. He did not sleep much. Instead, he lay awake, staring at the back wall, tracing imaginary lines through it into the hill beyond. He thought about air and water and fire in a space that would have none of them unless he carried them there himself. He made plans to keep a lamp burning, to set the small stove he owned deep enough that smoke could be coaxed back out rather than trapped. He thought about how he would know when to stop digging, when the cold would finally lose its hold and the earth would take over. Morning found him at the wall with a hammer and chisel, his breath fogging the air in the steady clouds. The first strike rang through the cabin like a gunshot, startling in its finality. He paused, listening for some answering sound from the hill, but heard only the dull echo of his own action. The second strike sent a thin splinter of wood curling away from the log, and with it came a sensation that was equal parts fear and exhilaration. He was dismantling his only shelter in order to build another one he could not yet see, and the absurdity of it would have been laughable if the stakes were not so high. It took hours to open a hole large enough for him to see the packed earth beyond, and when he finally did, he stood back and stared at it as though he had uncovered a secret rather than a problem. The smell of soil drifted into the cabin, clean and faintly metallic, and for a moment he imagined that he could already feel a difference in the air. He fetched the pick and swung it into the exposed face of the hill. The impact jarred his arms to the shoulders, the vibration traveling through bone and muscle in a way he was not prepared for, and he nearly dropped the tool in surprise. By the end of the first day he had gained less than 2 feet, his hands raw beneath his gloves and his back screaming in protest. The earth was denser than he had expected, shot through with stone and roots that refused to yield without a fight. He worked until the lantern guttered and the cold crept back into the cabin, then wrapped his hands in cloth torn from an old shirt and soaked them in brine to keep the wounds clean. The pain was blinding, but it was clean, purposeful, the kind that came from action rather than endurance. He lay down that night with the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears, wondering if he had already made a mistake that would cost him everything. Yet, even as doubt pressed in, the memory of that hidden warmth in the hill pushed back, steady and unyielding. He had taken the first step, and the ground had not swallowed him yet. The next days followed the same pattern, each one a variation on the last. He rose before dawn, stoked the fire, then set to work with the pick, digging a little deeper each time, stopping often to fit the rough timbers he had cut into place as props. The supports were crude, notched by hand and wedged tight against the ceiling, but they held, and with every inch of progress he felt the shape of the future room becoming more real. He learned to read the soil, to listen for the hollow sound that meant he had gone too far without bracing, to feel the subtle shift in resistance that warned of a pocket of looser earth. By the 5th day, his hands were a map of blisters and cuts, the skin split so deeply in places that he could see the pale tissue beneath. He ran out of cloth and resorted to smearing flour paste into the worst cracks to stem the bleeding, an old remedy his mother had used when they could not afford anything else. At night, he soaked his hands in salt water until he had to grit his teeth to keep from crying out, then wrapped them in rendered fat to keep them from sticking to the bandages he fashioned from rags. He knew the town was talking. Hullridge was too small for anything to go unnoticed, and he had been seen hauling timber and tools with a purpose he could not disguise. He did not go to the store anymore, preferring to make do with what he had, because he did not trust himself to ignore the looks and the whispers that would follow him down the aisles. It was enough that the hill and the cabin bore witness to what he was doing. He did not need an audience. By the end of the week, the hole behind the back wall had become a short tunnel, barely wide enough for his shoulders, its floor slick with packed clay and his own sweat. He crouched inside it one evening, the lantern casting long shadows across the rough supports, and held his hand against the wall. The cold was still there, but muted, as it had been in the crack he had found, and the realization sent a tremor through him that had nothing to do with the chill. He was not imagining it. The earth was already changing the terms of the battle. He climbed back into the cabin and leaned against the ruined wall, too tired to do more than breathe, but in that moment of exhaustion he felt something like certainty take hold. The work ahead was daunting, the risks real, but the logic was sound. He would go deeper. He would reinforce every step. He would carve out a place where winter could not reach him so easily, and if he had to bleed for it, then so be it. The hill had given him an opening, and he was no longer content to stand outside it. By the time Elijah Brooks had carved the tunnel far enough to stand half upright inside it, the town had discovered what he was doing, and Hullridge was not a place that ever let curiosity remain private. It began with glances that lingered too long when he passed through the square, with the voices that dipped when he entered the general store, with children who stopped playing to stare as though he were some rare animal wandering into their midst. He did not need to hear the words to understand their shape. The work he was doing had a look to it that could not be mistaken. Dirt ground into the seams of his clothes, raw wounds on his hands, the distracted air of a man living two lives at once, one above ground and one beneath it. The first open laugh came from a farmer whose land bordered the creek, a man with red cheeks and a voice that carried even when he tried to soften it. Elijah had paused to pick up a sack of flour, his fingers stiff from the cold and the bandages he wore, when the sound rang out behind him. It was not a single bark of amusement, but a rolling thing, fed by the reactions of others who had been waiting for permission to express what they already felt. Someone made a remark about digging a grave instead of a house, someone else about animals that burrowed because they did not know better, and the laughter swelled until the caretaker of the store cleared his throat in a half-hearted attempt at order. Elijah said nothing. He had learned long ago that words were a currency he did not possess in equal measure, and that any response he offered would be weighed not by its truth, but by the mouth that formed it. He paid for his flour, ignoring the way the sack was slid toward him rather than placed in his hands, and left with his shoulders stiff and his gaze fixed on the snow-packed road ahead. He told himself the cold was the reason his eyes burned, but he knew better. The jokes did not stop at the store. They followed him down the street, clung to the edges of conversations in the mission house, turned up in the tone of voices when he passed a group of men repairing a fence. Someone had heard he was carving a cave into the hill, someone else had heard he was planning to live underground like a mole, and by the end of the week the stories had grown elaborate enough to include claims that he had already collapsed part of the slope and was too proud to admit it. He let the rumors run their course because he had no energy to spend on stopping them, and because the hill behind his cabin was indifferent to gossip. That indifference became his refuge. He rose before the town was fully awake and returned after dusk, his days defined by the rhythm of pick against clay, the careful placement of timber props, the long moments of listening for any sound that did not belong. He learned to feel the difference between soil that would hold and soil that would betray him, the way a miner might read the subtle language of rock. He was no miner, not really, but the books he had read and the necessity of the work sharpened his senses until he could almost tell by touch when he had gone too far without reinforcing the ceiling. Still, the risks were real, and they made themselves known in small, unsettling ways. One afternoon, as he swung the pick into a stubborn knot of stone, the earth above him shuddered and released a shower of fine grit that pattered against his shoulders and face. He froze, every muscle coiled, waiting for the ceiling to give way, but it held. He retreated carefully, wedged a new beam into place with hands that shook despite his efforts, and did not resume work until his breathing had slowed. That night, he lay awake longer than usual, replaying the sound of that shudder in his mind, the reminder that the hill was not an idea, but a weight. The town's attention, meanwhile, had sharpened from mockery into something more pointed. On the 10th day after he had begun, he returned from the creek with a load of stones for the arch he planned to build at the entrance, only to find that part of the timber stack he had prepared for supports was gone. He stood in the snow behind the cabin, staring at the bare patch where the beams had been, feeling a cold that had nothing to do with the air. He searched the area, following footprints that led away toward the forest and then vanished in a tangle of overlapping tracks. Whoever had taken the wood had done so deliberately, choosing pieces that were already cut to length, leaving behind those he had not yet prepared. He replaced them over the next 2 days, felling more trees under a sky that seemed to grow heavier with every hour. But the incident lodged in his mind like a splinter. It was one thing to work alone, to endure laughter and disbelief, but another entirely to realize that someone might prefer his failure to his survival. He began to reinforce the entrance to the tunnel not just against collapse, but against intrusion, fitting a rough barrier of planks that could be wedged in place when he was below ground, a gesture that made him feel foolish even as it gave him a measure of comfort. The whispers grew bolder as winter tightened its grip on Hullridge. Children dared each other to run past his cabin at dusk, shouting questions into the darkness behind the back wall, then sprinting away before he could respond. Once he found a crude drawing scratched into the door with a nail, a stick figure disappearing into a hole in the earth, the lines exaggerated into something monstrous. He scrubbed it away with snow, his fingers numb, and did not look back when he returned inside. Yet the work continued inch by hard-won inch. By mid-November, the tunnel had reached a depth that felt different from the shallow beginnings, the air cooler in summer's sense, but strangely forgiving in the face of the season. He could stand upright now, the ceiling rising high enough that he no longer had to hunch, and the space ahead of him hinted at the room he intended to carve out. He marked the boundaries with charcoal, sketching the outline of walls that would one day hold more than just his own breath. It was during this period that a man named Charles Whitmore came to the cabin. Whitmore was known in Hullridge as someone who had apprenticed in a quarry in his youth, a detail he mentioned often enough that it had become part of his identity. Elijah heard the knock at the front door late one afternoon, the sound of it echoing oddly in the hollowed space behind the back wall, and when he opened it, he found Whitmore standing in the snow with his hat in his hands. Whitmore did not laugh. He did not even smile. He asked to see the tunnel, his gaze flicking past Elijah's shoulder to the place where the cabin ended and the hill began. Elijah hesitated, then stepped aside. He did not trust this man any more than he trusted the others, but curiosity had a way of disarming caution, and part of him wanted someone to witness the reality of what he was building. They stood in the lantern light, the rough timbers casting striped shadows across the clay walls, and Whitmore ran his fingers along one of the supports with an expression that was almost thoughtful. He said nothing for a long time, then shook his head slowly. He remarked on the weight of the hill, on the danger of going too far without proper shoring, on the way frost could creep deeper than expected if water found its way into the wrong cracks. It was not a warning delivered with kindness, but neither was it a mockery. It was simply an assessment, and when he left he did not offer to help, but he did not take anything either. Elijah watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and unease. It would have been easier if Whitmore had laughed like the others. The absence of ridicule left too much room for doubt. That doubt followed him into the tunnel the next day, when he discovered that someone had tampered with the barrier he had set in place, prying loose a plank so that it hung askew, barely held by one nail. He stood there for a long time, the pick resting against his shoulder, imagining the consequences if the board had fallen while he was below. The thought of being trapped, of calling out into the earth with no one able or willing to hear, tightened around his heart until he had to lean against the wall to steady himself. He did not retreat. Instead, he fixed the barrier more securely than before, driving in additional nails, wedging the planks so tightly that they could not be shifted without a hammer. He began to work with a new vigilance, checking every support twice, listening to the sounds of the hill not just for signs of collapse, but for any hint of intrusion. The earth had become his ally, but the world above it was proving itself less predictable. The physical toll of the labor mounted as the days shortened. His hands, never fully healed from the first week, split open again and again, the skin refusing to toughen no matter how much he asked of it. Blood stained the handle of the pick, the clay floor, the cuffs of his sleeves. He wrapped and rewrapped his fingers, whispering his mother's old remedies under his breath like prayers. And when the pain threatened to overwhelm him, he focused on the slow, measured growth of the tunnel, the way the space answered him with a depth he could almost feel in his bones. At night, he dreamed of the hill closing over him, of the ceiling pressing down until the air was squeezed from his lungs, and he woke with a gasp, his heart hammering, only to find the familiar frost patterns blooming on the cabin walls. The contrast was a reminder of why he was doing this. The earth could betray him, yes, but so could winter, and winter had proven itself merciless more times than he could count. By the time Thanksgiving passed unnoticed in Hallridge, the tunnel had reached nearly 10 feet, and the beginnings of a chamber were taking shape at its end. He smoothed the walls with the flat of his shovel, imagining shelves, a sleeping platform, a place where the stove might sit, and for the first time he allowed himself to think beyond survival to something like comfort. It was a dangerous indulgence, he knew, because the town had not yet finished with him, and the hill had not yet revealed all its secrets. The whispers had changed tone by then, taken on a sharper edge. It was no longer just laughter, but a kind of morbid anticipation, as though his neighbors were waiting for the story to resolve itself in the way stories like this were supposed to. Elijah heard it in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, in the way children were pulled closer to their parents when he passed, in the sympathetic looks that felt more like rehearsals for a funeral than gestures of concern. He carried that knowledge with him into the dark of the tunnel, into the labor that left his muscles trembling and his lungs burning, and he made a quiet promise to himself in the deepening space he was carving from the hill. He would not become their lesson. He would not let the earth claim him just to satisfy the expectations of those who had never believed he belonged here in the first place. The work was too far along for that. The warmth he could feel in the walls too real to deny. The hill pressed in around him, patient and heavy, and he pressed back with timber and will, digging deeper not just into the ground, but into a resolve he had not known he possessed. The town might be watching, might be waiting, but down here, where the cold lost some of its bite and the world narrowed to the sound of his own breath, he was alone with the earth, and for now that was enough. By late November, the world above Elijah Brooks had narrowed to a single daily truth, the coming of winter that no longer felt abstract but physical, pressing itself against every surface, every joint in his body, every hope he had not yet fully allowed to live. The tunnel behind the back wall had grown deep enough that the lantern's light no longer reached its end, and the work of the past weeks had shifted from the brutal novelty of breaking ground to the quieter, more complicated labor of shaping a space that could be trusted. It was no longer enough to carve forward. Now he had to carve outward, to turn the narrow passage into something that could hold a man upright without reminding him at every breath how much weight hovered above his skull. He began each morning by standing at the threshold of the tunnel, looking into the half-lit corridor of clay and timber, and listening. The hill had its own sounds, a slow internal language of settling and compression that he had learned to distinguish from danger. The absence of sound was sometimes worse than its presence. A sudden silence in the wrong place could mean that something had shifted without his consent. He learned to recognize the faint crackle of frost working its way deeper into the soil, the muted groan of a support beam under new stress, the whisper of loose grit that foretold a cave-in if he ignored it. The first step in transforming the tunnel into a room was choosing where it should begin. He paced the length of the passage, measuring with his boots, feeling for the point where the air changed ever so slightly, where the cold did not cling as stubbornly to his skin. That was where he marked the wall with charcoal, drawing a rough rectangle that would one day hold more than his body hunched over a pick. He wanted space for a sleeping platform, for shelves to hold food and water, for the little stove that would make this place something more than a hole in the ground. It was a tall order for a man working alone with bleeding hands, but the alternative was a winter that could kill him just as surely as the hill. He began by widening the tunnel laterally, attacking the clay at shoulder height, then above his head, careful not to remove more than he could brace before nightfall. The earth resisted him with a stubbornness that felt personal, Roots ran through the walls like old scars, forcing him to pry and twist rather than cut. And so stones lay hidden in the clay until the pick struck them with a jarring clang that traveled up his arms and into his teeth. Every few feet, he stopped to wedge new beams into place, notching them by hand so they would bite into the ceiling and floor, forming a crude skeleton that held the hill at bay. The deeper he went, the more he understood why the books had emphasized patience. This was not work that could be rushed. Once, when exhaustion tempted him to skip a support, to tell himself that one more foot would not make a difference, he felt the ceiling above him sag by a fraction of an inch, enough to send a cascade of dirt onto his shoulders. He did not need more than that to drive the lesson home. He retreated, braced the spot he had neglected, and did not move forward again until the hill felt stable under his hands. As the chamber took shape, he turned his attention to the entrance, because he knew that no room was safe if the door to it could not be trusted. The back wall of the cabin was now little more than a jagged opening, the boards removed and stacked in a corner, and beyond it the tunnel yawned like a wound that would not close. He had always intended to build a proper arch there, something that would distribute the weight of the hill rather than asking wood alone to bear it, but the reality of that task had grown heavier as the days shortened. He had never laid stone in his life. He had read about it, studied diagrams of Roman vaults and medieval cellars, but there was a gulf between understanding a principle and executing it with hands that shook from fatigue. He gathered the stones he had been collecting from the creek bed and spread them out on a tarp in the cabin, turning them over in the lantern light, feeling their curves and edges, trying to imagine how they might fit together. The idea of the arch was simple in theory. Each stone leaned on the next, and the weight that threatened to crush the opening was instead carried along the curve and into the surrounding earth. The trick was in making that curve precise enough that the stones would support one another rather than slipping free. He built a wooden form first, a half circle of rough boards nailed together and braced so that it could stand inside the opening without shifting. It took him 2 days to get it right, adjusting the angle by fractions, shaving off corners, stepping back again and again to judge the line it made against the dark of the tunnel beyond. When he finally wedged it into place, he felt a tremor of anticipation that was almost like fear. Everything that followed would depend on whether he had measured well enough. The laying of the stones became a ritual. He mixed mortar in small batches in a battered bucket, the smell of wet lime sharp in the confined space, then chose a stone, tested it against its neighbors, and spread the paste in a thin layer before pressing it into position. He began at the base on either side, building upward in careful symmetry, each piece chosen for the way it nested against the curve of the form. His arms burned from holding the stones overhead. His back protested every bend, but he did not stop. He could not afford to. The mortar would not wait for him to rest, and the form would not hold the weight indefinitely. As he worked, the town came to watch. They did not announce themselves. He would glance up from the arch to find a cluster of figures in the doorway of the cabin, stamping snow from their boots, their breath clouding the air as they leaned in to see what the fool at the edge of Hullridge was attempting now. He heard the murmurs, the predictions offered with the confidence of men who had never tried to do the thing they dismissed. He felt their presence like a pressure on the back of his neck, a reminder that he was performing whether he wished to or not. One man, older than the rest, with hands that bore the memory of tools long put away, shook his head slowly and said the stones were the wrong shape, that the curve was too shallow, that the whole thing would come down the first time Elijah tried to hang a door on it. Elijah did not answer. He set another stone, wiped mortar from his fingers, and kept working. The words slid off him not because they lacked sting, but because he had no room left for them. Every doubt he allowed into his mind was a fraction of strength he could not spare. The arch took 14 days. 14 days of cold seeping into his bones, of mortar stiffening too quickly, of stones that refused to fit no matter how many times he turned them. 14 days of returning to the cabin each night with arms that barely lifted him into bed, only to rise before dawn and begin again. On the final morning, he stood alone before the opening, the curve of the arch complete save for the keystone at its crown. The stone lay on the table behind him, heavier than any of the others, its edges ground to match the angle of the curve. He lifted it with both hands, his muscles screaming, and eased it into place. For a moment, it did not seem to want to settle, hovering on the edge of balance, and then the weight of the stones on either side pressed in, and the keystone slid home with a soft, final sound. He did not move for a long time. He waited for the telltale crack, the cascade of dust that would mean he had failed. When nothing happened, he reached up and tapped the wooden form with the handle of his pick. It did not shift. He knocked away the braces that held it in place, heart hammering, and watched as the form sagged free and fell away from the arch. The stones did not move. The curve held. The silence in the cabin was so complete he could hear the blood in his ears. Somewhere behind him a man cleared his throat, and Elijah realized the doorway was crowded again. The town assembled to witness either disaster or proof. No one laughed this time. They stood and stared at the arch, at the impossible line of stone holding back a hillside, and in their quiet he found a satisfaction deeper than any praise could have offered. The door came next. Compared to the arch, it was a simpler task, but it carried its own weight of consequence. He cut a slab of oak from the remnants of an abandoned barn, planed it smooth, and fitted iron hinges he had salvaged from a broken gate. He measured the opening again and again, shaving off fractions of wood until the door fit the curve like a cork in a bottle. When he hung it in place and swung it shut for the first time, the sound was deep and resonant, a note of finality that echoed through the cabin and into the tunnel beyond. He stood there with his hand on the latch, imagining what it would mean to close himself inside the hill, to trust his life to the work of his hands and the patience of the earth. The town drifted away behind him, their curiosity sated for the moment, and the cabin felt suddenly empty despite the half-built tunnel that now dominated it. Winter was not waiting. It was already here, pressing against the windows, creeping along the seams, making its presence known in the slow accumulation of frost. Elijah knew he could not delay any longer. The chamber had to be finished before the cold finished with him. That night, he slept with the door ajar, the arch framing the darkness beyond, and for the first time in weeks he dreamed not of collapse or suffocation, but of space, of a room that belonged to him alone, hidden beneath the hill, waiting for him to step inside and claim it. December announced itself not with celebration, but with a tightening of the world. The snow that had flirted with the fields in November now settled with authority, smoothing every contour into the same blank declaration of winter's rule. Elijah Brooks stood in the doorway of his cabin on the first morning of the month, the round stone arch behind him and the new oak door still smelling faintly of sawdust and iron oil, and watched the frost form along the edge of the porch rail as if it were being painted in real time. He had built what he could build. Now the season would decide whether it was enough. The first night he spent fully inside the chamber beneath the hill, he did so with a caution that bordered on reverence. He lit the small stove he had dragged down the tunnel and set against the far wall, feeding it only a handful of split kindling, more curious than confident about how the air would behave in a space so different from the open room of his cabin. He left the round door ajar, just wide enough to let the faint light from the hearth spill in, and sat on the rough plank he had laid across two supports to serve as a bench, listening. There were no echoes the way he had expected. The sound of the fire was muted, the crackle swallowed by the clay walls and the thick curve of stone at the entrance. The air did not rush towards the flame as it did above ground. It seemed to settle instead, holding the warmth close, coaxing it outward rather than letting it escape. He reached for the thermometer he had tacked to one of the beams and watched the mercury climb, not quickly, but steadily, until it reached a number that made him blink. It was warmer than the cabin had ever been in December, and the stove had barely begun to work. He slept on the plank that night, wrapped in his coat, the smell of damp earth around him, and woke hours later with the sensation that something fundamental had changed. The cold was still there, but it had lost its teeth. It no longer sank into his bones with the same relentless insistence. The walls around him felt cool to the touch, but not hostile, and when he stepped back into the cabin at dawn, he did so with a clarity that startled him. The cabin was a shell now, a place of preparation and labor rather than refuge. The refuge lay behind him under the hill. The following days became a study in contrasts. Above ground, he continued to patch and brace the failing structure of the cabin, sealing the worst of the gaps, reinforcing the roof against the weight of the coming snow, but he no longer fought the cold there with the same desperation. He let the fire burn lower, saving wood for when it truly mattered, and spent his evenings below, in the room that seemed to exist outside the logic of winter. The air down there smelled of clay and smoke, a scent that settled into his clothes and hair, and he found that he carried it with him even when he climbed back into the frozen daylight. It was not all comfort. As the days passed, he began to notice a dampness creeping into the corners of the chamber, a thin sheen of moisture that gathered on the coldest stones and beaded on the timber supports. He wiped it away with rags, then checked the walls more closely, feeling for places where water might find its way in when the thaw eventually came. The books he had read had warned him about this, about the way underground rooms could become traps of mold and rot if they were not given a way to breathe. He had no ventilation shaft yet, no dedicated path for stale air to escape, and the realization that he had traded one threat for another pressed at the edges of his newfound peace. He compensated as best he could, cracking the door open wider at night, adjusting the stove so it drew more aggressively, anything to keep the air moving. It was a temporary solution, and he knew it, but December was not the month for new shafts or long climbs to the surface. December was the month for holding what you had built against the cold and hoping it would hold you in return. The town watched these changes with a confusion that bordered on unease. They saw less smoke from Elijah's chimney and drew their own conclusions, whispering about madness and foolishness with a nervous edge that had not been there before. He did not hear the words directly, but he felt the shift in the way people looked at him when he passed, the uncertainty that replaced outright mockery. They could not reconcile the image of a man abandoning his fire in the depths of winter with their own understanding of survival, and that unsettled them more than his digging ever had. Elijah, meanwhile, had begun to prepare for something he could not yet name. The wind changed its voice in early December, rising in fits rather than settling into the steady moan that accompanied most storms, and the sky took on a metallic hue that reminded him of the moments before a heavy snowfall. He brought more supplies down into the chamber, stacking sacks of flour and dried beans against the wall, filling jugs with water from the creek while it was still accessible. He carried down extra blankets, a spare lantern, the few keepsakes he had that could not be replaced. Each trip through the round door felt like a narrowing of the world, as though he were stepping not just into a room, but into a future that diverged from everything Hulridge had ever known. One night, he woke to the sound of the wind battering the cabin so hard that it made the timbers creak like old bones. He sat up on the plank, heart racing, and listened to the roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was different from the storms he had known, not content to announce itself and then settle into a rhythm, but rising and falling in unpredictable surges that rattled even the earth around him. He stood and climbed the tunnel, pulling the door open just far enough to peer into the cabin. Snow was pouring through the cracks in the walls, the drifts already high enough to obscure the lower panes of the windows. The fire in the hearth had guttered out, smothered by the wind that forced its way down the chimney, and the air in the room was colder than it had been in days. He closed the door again and leaned against it, feeling the weight of the hill press back, a solid, unyielding counterpoint to the chaos above. That night, he did not return to the cabin. He stayed in the chamber, feeding the stove sparingly, listening to the muffled fury of the storm through the clay walls. When he finally slept, it was with a sense of being cocooned rather than trapped, of having found a pocket of calm in the heart of something vast and violent. Morning did not bring relief. The storm had not spent itself in the night, but had gathered strength, its voice now a constant howl that seemed to scrape along the underside of the hill. Elijah woke to the realization that this was not an ordinary blizzard. He did not need the town's alarm bells or the sight of collapsed roofs to tell him that. The pressure in his ears, the way the wind seemed to bend the very air around him, the instinctive unease that made him move more quietly in the confined space of the chamber, all spoke of a storm that had not yet finished with them. He made a final trip to the cabin, moving quickly, shoveling snow away from the door with hands already numb, dragging down the last of his supplies before the drifts grew too high to pass. When he sealed the round door behind him, the sound of the storm dimmed to a distant thunder, and in the sudden quiet he felt the full weight of what he had done. He had chosen the earth over the sky, had committed himself to a refuge that had never been tested by something like this. The chamber held steady around him. The thermometer crept upward as the stove warmed the air, the dampness retreating from the walls under the gentle pressure of heat. He paced the small room, checking his supplies, listening to the faint tremors that filtered down through the hill, and tried to imagine what was happening above. Hulridge lay somewhere beyond the clay and stone, his houses and stores and church facing the storm with nothing but wood and fire between them and the cold. He did not yet know that this would be the storm that changed everything, only that it was unlike any he had known before, and that for the first time since winter had taken hold, he was not afraid of what the night might bring. The storm did not arrive all at once. It came in layers, each one heavier than the last, as though the sky were testing Hulridge before committing fully to its destruction. Elijah Brooks felt the change before he saw it. Deep in the chamber, beneath the hill, the air seemed to tighten, the faint vibrations in the clay walls growing more pronounced, a low trembling that never quite settled. It was the kind of sensation a person could easily ignore if he wanted to believe in the reliability of weather and the stubbornness of routine, but Elijah had spent too long listening to the ground to dismiss it. The hill was speaking in a voice he had not yet learned to interpret, and instinct told him to pay attention. When he cracked open the round door, the cabin beyond was already half lost to the storm. Snow poured through the broken seams in the walls like sand through a sieve, forming drifts against the legs of the table, the base of the hearth, the scattered tools he had left behind. The roof groaned under a weight it had never been asked to bear, and the wind found every weakness, prying and tearing with a persistence that bordered on intent. He closed the door again quickly, not wanting the fragile warmth of the chamber to be stolen by the fury outside, and stood for a moment in the dim light of his lantern, letting the reality of the situation settle over him. This was not a storm that could be waited out in the cabin. It was not even a storm that respected the usual boundaries of shelter and exposure. It was a force that reduced distinctions, turning walls into suggestions and doors into inconveniences. The only reason he could think clearly at all was because the earth around him held firm, its ancient patience absorbing the noise and the cold and returning them to him as something distant, manageable. He fed the stove sparingly, mindful of the smoke and the preciousness of his wood, and began the quiet work of endurance. Hours passed in a haze of listening and waiting, of checking the thermometer and the door latch, of imagining the town above him as a series of fragile shapes being reshaped by the storm. The roar that filtered through the hill was constant, but it was not uniform. It rose and fell in unpredictable waves, sometimes so loud he could feel it in his chest, sometimes fading to a low moan that made the silence afterward feel ominous. Sometime in the long, lightless afternoon he heard a new sound, one that did not belong to the storm. It was faint at first, a distant thudding that could easily have been mistaken for the shifting of snow or the groan of timber, but it carried a rhythm that set it apart. Elijah moved to the door and pressed his ear against the thick oak, listening with a focus he had not known he possessed. The sound came again, closer this time, unmistakably human. He opened the door a crack, bracing himself against the cold that rushed in, and peered into the cabin. Snow had filled the room almost to the height of the table, and the door to the outside was buried entirely, its outline barely visible beneath the drift. He could see nothing beyond the narrow tunnel of light cast by his lantern, but the thudding came again, closer, and with it a muffled cry that cut through the wind. Elijah did not hesitate. He pulled the door wide and forced his way into the cabin, shoveling snow aside with his hands, pushing toward the back wall where the drift was deepest. The cold hit him like a living thing, stealing the breath from his lungs, but he kept moving, driven by the knowledge that whatever waited on the other side of that wall was closer to death than he had ever been. The thudding grew louder, resolving itself into the sound of fists striking wood, and when he reached the door that opened to the outside, he tore at the snow until the handle was free. The man who fell through the opening when he pulled the door open was half buried, his coat stiff with ice, his face gray with cold. Elijah dragged him inside and slammed the door shut behind them, the wind clawing at the edges as though reluctant to release its prize. He hauled the stranger through the drifts to the round door and into the chamber, where the warmth of the earth met them like an embrace. The man did not speak. He only clung to Elijah's sleeve, his body shaking with a violence that had nothing to do with fear. More came. They did not arrive as a crowd, but in scattered, desperate ones and twos, following some instinct that led them away from collapsing roofs and blocked roads toward the one place in Hullridge that still offered something other than a battle. A woman with a child wrapped in a blanket appeared at the door, her eyes wide with shock, her steps uncertain in the deepening snow. An older couple stumbled in together, leaning on each other with a determination that bordered on defiance. Each time Elijah forced the door open, he felt as though he were opening it into a different world, one where the rules he had known no longer applied. He brought them all down into the chamber, his small refuge swelling with bodies and breath until it no longer felt like a room, but like a living thing. The air grew thick with the scent of wet wool and fear, with the sound of coughing and whispered reassurances. He set the stove to burn hotter than he had dared before, watching the thermometer climb as the heat of so many people began to change the atmosphere. It was a risk. He knew that too much fire could rob them of air, that smoke could build in a space never meant to hold so many, but the alternative was unthinkable. As the chamber filled, so did his responsibilities. He guided people to the driest spots, arranged them along the walls where the supports were strongest, handed out what blankets and spare clothes he had. He said little, not because he lacked words, but because there were too many variables to control and he could not afford to lose focus. He listened constantly, not just to the storm, but to the room itself, attuned to the way the air moved, the way the heat pooled and shifted. He adjusted the stove's damper, cracked the door open in brief, careful intervals to let stale air escape, then sealed it again before the cold could undo what the earth was doing for them. Outside, the storm raged with an indifference that bordered on cruelty. He could hear it through the hill now, not as a roar, but as a pressure, a force that seemed to push down on the chamber from all sides. He imagined Hull Ridge above them as a landscape of broken shapes, houses folded in on themselves, streets erased by drifts that reached for the rooftops. He did not know how many were left out there, how many had found their way to him, and how many were trapped beyond reach, but he felt the weight of them all in the narrow space of his refuge. At one point, the stove began to smoke, the thin stream of gray thickening until it stung his eyes. He reacted instantly, opening the door wider than he dared, letting the cold slash into the room in order to draw the smoke out. The temperature dropped sharply, drawing a collective murmur from the people pressed against the walls, but the air cleared and he adjusted the flue before closing the door again. The earth reclaimed the warmth slowly, patiently, as though it had always intended to carry this burden. Night fell without ceremony. The darkness above filtered down into the chamber not as absence of light, but as a change in the quality of the storm's voice. The children who had come with their parents cried until exhaustion claimed them, their small bodies huddled against strangers who held them because there was no one else to do so. The adults spoke in low tones, sharing fragments of what they had seen. Roofs torn away, barns collapsed, a schoolhouse buried to its windows. Elijah listened without interrupting, committing their words to memory as though he might need them later, though he did not yet know why. By the time the storm reached its height, the chamber held more people than Elijah had ever imagined fitting within its walls. The heat had climbed to a level that would have seemed miraculous in any other winter, and yet the air felt thin, the margins for error shrinking with every additional breath drawn in the confined space. He remained awake long after the others had fallen into uneasy sleep, sitting by the stove with his back against the clay wall, his senses stretched to their limit. He thought of the arch he had built, of the beams wedged into the ceiling, of the hill that now bore not just his life, but the lives of everyone crowded into this pocket of warmth. The storm did not end that night, or the next. It went on as though it had forgotten the concept of stopping, and Elijah learned what it meant to exist in a place that was both sanctuary and siege. He rationed wood, counted breaths, measured heat in the subtle shifts of comfort and discomfort around him. He was no longer a man who had dug a hole in his wall. He was the keeper of a refuge that had never been tested like this. And the hill, ancient and implacable, was the only thing standing between the people of Hullridge and the cold that would claim them if it could. When the storm finally began to loosen its grip on Hullridge, it did so without ceremony, as though it had simply grown tired of its own cruelty. There was no moment of triumph, no sudden silence to announce that the worst had passed. Instead, the roar that had battered the hill for days softened into a weary moan, the pressure in the chamber easing by degrees so subtle that Elijah Brooks did not trust them at first. He had learned during those endless hours beneath the earth that hope could be as dangerous as fear, and he waited for the hill itself to tell him that it was safe to breathe again. The chamber had become a world unto itself. Bodies lay pressed together along the clay walls, wrapped in coats and blankets that steamed faintly in the warm, crowded air. Children slept in uneasy knots, their dreams broken by the distant howling that still filtered down through layers of stone and soil. Adults stirred and shifted, the stiffness of prolonged immobility etched into every movement, but they did so quietly, as though noise itself might wake the storm above. The stove glowed low and steady in its corner, a red heart in the dimness, fed by Elijah's careful hand with a restraint born of necessity. He had not slept more than a few minutes at a time since the first of them had arrived. His rest came in fragments, his mind never fully letting go of the sounds and sensations that defined this place now. He listened to the rhythm of breathing around him, counted it unconsciously, measuring the health of the room by the absence of panic rather than its presence. Each time he cracked the door to vent the smoke or let fresh air circulate, the cold reached in with an eagerness that made him flinch, and he learned to balance the needs of heat and air with the precision of a man walking a narrow bridge in the dark. It was during one of these brief intervals, when he had opened the door, just enough to clear the haze that had begun to gather near the ceiling, that he realized the storm's voice had changed. The roar that had been a constant companion for days was now broken, uneven, no longer the wall of sound that had defined their isolation. He closed the door again and sat back on his heels, letting the small difference settle into his awareness. It was not relief he felt, but the cautious recognition of a shift in the world above. As the hours passed, the people in the chamber began to stir with more intention. A woman whose hair had turned white in the space of a few days sat up and began to whisper to the child pressed against her side, her voice hoarse but steady. A man near the door shifted his weight and winced, rubbing at a leg that had gone numb, and the sound drew a ripple of quiet laughter that was more surprise than amusement. The chamber was no longer a place of waiting. It was becoming a place of recovery. Elijah moved among them with a gentleness he had not known he possessed, checking on those who had arrived the most exhausted, offering sips of water where he could spare it, redistributing blankets to the coldest corners. He had not planned for this, had not imagined himself in the role of caretaker for a room full of neighbors who had once looked through him rather than at him, but necessity had a way of reshaping identities. The man who had dug alone in the hill now found himself a point of quiet gravity around which the fragile calm of the chamber revolved. The change in the storm above did not mean that the danger had passed. The real work, he knew, would begin when they emerged into whatever world the blizzard had left behind. He thought of the houses he had passed on his walks into town, the thin roofs and leaning walls, the church with its proud steeple, the schoolhouse where children learned their letters. He imagined them now under the weight of days of unrelenting snow and wind, and the picture that formed in his mind was not a hopeful one. Late in what must have been the third morning since the storm had trapped them, he opened the round door and climbed into the cabin. The drift that had filled the room was higher than before, pressed against the ceiling in places, and he had to tunnel his way through it with his hands before he could reach the outer door. When he finally forced it open, the light that spilled in was not the dull gray of storm, but something brighter, cleaner, a pale winter sun that made him squint. Hallridge lay transformed beyond the threshold. The road that had once led past his cabin was gone, erased beneath a smooth expanse of white that reached toward the center of town. Roofs protruded at odd angles from the drifts, some intact, others caved in, their lines broken and softened by snow. Fences were buried entirely, barns reduced to vague humps in the distance, and the wind that still moved across the fields no longer howled but sighed, as though exhausted by its own violence. He stood there for a long moment, the cold biting at his face, and then he turned back to the chamber. It was time. The exodus was not swift. People emerged in small groups, their legs stiff, their expressions wary as they took in the altered landscape. Some cried openly when they recognized the ruins of their homes, the places where their lives had been interrupted, now reshaped beyond easy repair. Others stood in silence, absorbing the damage with a stoicism that spoke of losses they had not yet named. Elijah remained at the threshold of the round door, watching them go, counting heads without knowing exactly what number he hoped to reach. When the chamber was empty, the quiet it left behind felt louder than the storm ever had. He went back inside and sat on the plank that had served as his bed, letting the silence wash over him, his body heavy with exhaustion. He did not stay long. There was work to be done, and he knew that if he allowed himself to rest too deeply, he might not rise again. The days that followed were a blur of digging and lifting, of shovels biting into drifts that were higher than a man in places, of voices calling out names in the hope that someone would answer. Elijah worked alongside the others now, not as an outsider but as a necessary part of the effort. He knew how to move through snow that had compacted under its own weight, how to listen for the hollow sound that meant a buried roof rather than a solid wall, how to carve a path where there had been none. They found survivors where they could, people who had managed to hold on in pockets of air under collapsed beams or behind blocked doors, and they found those who had not been so fortunate. Each discovery carved something new into the collective memory of Hallridge, a reckoning with the limits of what wood and fire could accomplish against a storm that did not care about tradition or habit. Through it all, Elijah felt the eyes of the town on him in a way he never had before. There was no laughter now, no whispered predictions of his failure. There was instead a quiet, almost reverent awareness of what his stubbornness had made possible. They had seen the inside of the hill, had felt the warmth that came not from burning, but from being held, and the experience had changed the shape of their understanding. On the third evening after the storm broke, when the worst of the digging was done, and people had returned to whatever fragments of home they could still claim, a man approached Elijah as he stood at the edge of the road, his shovel resting against his shoulder. It was the same farmer who had laughed in the general store weeks before, the one whose voice had carried farthest. He did not speak right away. He simply held out his hand, the gesture awkward and unpracticed, and when Elijah took it he felt something in himself shift, as though a long-standing tension had finally been allowed to release. There were no grand speeches, no formal declarations of gratitude. Hallridge was not a town that knew how to put words to change, but as the days passed and the work of rebuilding began, Elijah found that doors were held open for him now, that tools were offered without his having to ask, that people sought his opinion on matters that had once been none of his concern. They did not call him a hero, not yet, but they no longer treated him as a cautionary tale either. At night, he returned to the chamber beneath the hill, its walls still warm, its air still forgiven, and lay on the plank with a weariness that sank deep into his bones. He thought of the days spent listening to the storm, of the moment he had first felt the thudding against his door, of the faces that had filled his refuge with fear and then with fragile relief. He had built the room for himself, driven by nothing more noble than the desire to survive another winter, but it had become something larger in spite of him. The hill had not changed. It still loomed behind his cabin, indifferent to the drama it had witnessed, its ancient patience unbroken. What had changed was the space between that patience and the people who lived above it, the narrow margin of understanding that Elijah had carved out with his hands and his stubborn refusal to accept that winter was an enemy that could only be fought on its own terms. The storm had passed, leaving behind more than wreckage. It had left behind a question that Hallridge could no longer ignore, and the answer lay not in the broken roofs or the buried roads, but in the round door set into the back wall of a cabin at the edge of the town. Spring did not arrive in Hallridge so much as it was uncovered. The snow retreated by degrees, surrendering first the tops of fences, then the roofs that had survived the blizzard, and finally the roads that reappeared as muddy scars across a landscape still struggling to remember its former shape. Elijah Brooks watched the thaw from the doorway of his cabin, the round stone arch behind him catching the light of days that were no longer immediately hostile, and felt the weight of what had changed settle slowly into his understanding. The storm had not simply broken roofs and barns. It had broken a way of thinking that had stood unchallenged for generations. The first real sign of that change came not in words, but in footsteps. Men and women began to make the long walk to the edge of town, to stand in the yard behind Elijah's cabin and look at the hill with the same wary curiosity he had felt months before. They did not always knock. Often they lingered, studying the way the ground sloped, the way the stone arch framed the darkness beyond the back wall, the way warmth still seemed to cling to that opening even on days when the wind cut through coats as if they were paper. Elijah did not chase them away. He had learned that curiosity, once it replaced ridicule, was a fragile thing that needed room to breathe. When they finally began to ask questions, he answered them as plainly as he could. He spoke of depth and patience, of the way the earth held to its own slow temperature when the air above it went mad, of the mistakes he had made, and the small, stubborn triumphs that had kept him alive. He did not dress the story in grand language. He did not claim invention or brilliance. He told them simply what he had done, how it had nearly killed him, and how it had saved them all in the end. The first family to act on his words lived only 2 houses away from the center of Hallridge, in a place where the land rose gently enough that a shallow dig could reach the shelter of the hill. They began in late April, when the frost line had retreated far enough to make the work possible, and Elijah went to them every morning before tending his own land. He showed them how to read the soil, how to set the first supports, how to measure a curve not by the eye alone, but by the way it carried weight. He watched as their hands blistered and bled just as his had, and he did not spare them the truth about what it would cost, because he had learned that survival did not grow from comfort. By the time summer took hold, there were 3 such projects underway in Hallridge, their rough entrances marked by piles of earth and timber that looked, to an untrained eye, like the beginnings of graves rather than homes. But no one laughed now. Children were kept at a respectful distance, not out of fear, but out of a new awareness of danger, and the adults worked with a focus that bordered on reverence. The memory of the storm was too close, too heavy for anything else. Elijah's own chamber did not remain as it had been. He improved it in small, thoughtful ways that spoke of a mind no longer content with mere sufficiency. He dug a narrow ventilation shaft that angled upward behind the hill, capping it with a simple hood that let air escape without inviting the weather to follow. He smoothed the walls where his earlier haste had left them jagged, added shelves and a raised sleeping platform, built a second door further down the tunnel to create a pocket of stillness that trapped heat between two layers of oak and stone. Each change was a quiet acknowledgement of lessons learned the hard way. As the months passed, the idea spread beyond Hullridge. Travelers stopped in the town on their way north or west, heard the story in fragments over meals taken in half-repaired kitchens, and carried it with them when they left. A newspaper from a neighboring county printed a short piece about the man who had hidden from a blizzard beneath a hill and emerged with 30 lives in his care, and though it did not name him, everyone in Hullridge recognized the shape of the truth in its lines. The greatest change, however, was not in the number of shelters built or the miles the idea traveled. It was in Elijah himself. He had lived for years with the expectation of isolation, had accepted it as the natural order of things, but now he found that the rhythm of his days included other people in ways he had not anticipated. There were questions to answer, mistakes to correct, and occasionally arguments to settle when pride threatened to undo cooperation. He navigated these moments with a patience born of the work that had brought him here, never raising his voice, never claiming authority beyond what his experience granted him. One evening in late autumn, as the light faded early once more and the memory of winter stirred uneasily in the town, a woman arrived at his cabin with a child at her side. Her husband had died in the storm, buried beneath the collapse of a barn that had once seemed as solid as the hill itself, and she had no family left in Hullridge. She did not ask to stay. She simply stood there, her face worn by more than grief, and waited. Elijah did not need to consult anyone to know what he would do. He made space for them in his own chamber, adjusting shelves and platforms to accommodate 2 more lives, and, in doing so, acknowledged something he had not yet put into words. The refuge he had built was no longer his alone. The following winter came, and it was harsh, but it was not a terror. Hullridge met it with preparation rather than resignation, with doors set into hillsides and arches rising quietly from back walls, with ventilation shafts capped against the snow. When the first real blizzard swept through in January, it did damage, but it did not take the town by surprise. Families retreated below ground, emerging days later with stories of warmth that did not require constant feeding, of nights spent listening to the storm rather than fighting it. The earth had become part of their vocabulary, not as a threat, but as a partner. Years passed in this manner, each winter reinforcing the lesson Elijah had learned in blood and clay. He married the woman who had come to his door with her child, their life together shaped as much by the chamber beneath the hill as by the cabin above it. They raised children who learned to dig before they learned to read, who knew instinctively that the ground beneath their feet was not an enemy to be conquered, but a shelter to be understood. When Elijah grew old, the chamber he had carved with his own hands had become a small, underground home, its rooms connected by tunnels that bore the marks of decades of careful expansion. He moved through them with the ease of long familiarity, his body slower now, but his mind still alert to the subtle language of the earth. He died one winter night, as he had always hoped he would, not with the cold in his bones, but with the steady warmth of the hill holding him close. Ulrich remembered him not with statues or plaques, but with round doors set into slopes and stone arches that outlived the cabins they were built to serve. The town learned, through his example, that survival was not always a matter of standing taller or building thicker walls. Sometimes it was a matter of going where the heat already lived, of paying attention to the quiet lessons written into the land, and of understanding that the most radical ideas often began not in the halls of power, but in the hands of a man who refused to freeze when the world told him there was no other choice. If this story kept you on the edge, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you don't miss what comes next, because the next story is already waiting for you. Share this video with someone who loves real survival stories and write in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one.